Subscribe. Sign in. The 1% Gone Bad, Part 6. Open in app. Listen via. The 1% Gone Bad, Part 6. Compounds as city-states. MXTM aka Pirate 1 a VJ Sunu MIX. April 12, 2026. Part 6, The New Feudal Architecture. 26. Compounds as city-states. The city-state is the oldest political form that solved the fundamental problem of governance. How to organize a sufficient number of people, across a sufficient territory, with sufficient coordination to produce the collective functions, security, production, exchange, adjudication, that no individual can produce alone, while maintaining the concentration of authority necessary to make decisions at the speed that survival requires. The polis. The city republic. The merchant commune. The fortified trading post that became, through the accumulation of its own success, a civilization in miniature. Self-governing, self-defending, self-sustaining, recognizing no authority above itself except the specific external powers it had made specific agreements with for specific mutual advantages, and reserving, within those agreements, the essential sovereignty of self-determination, the right to govern its own interior according to its own laws, its own values, its own theory of who belonged and on what terms. Venice. Florence. Genoa. Hamburg. Singapore before the nation-state claimed it. Hong Kong before the nation-state reclaimed it. These were not failed nations. They were successful city-states, successful at the specific function the city-state form was designed to perform, the concentration of productive, commercial, and intellectual capability within a governed enclosure that could maintain its competitive advantage against the larger but less agile political formation surrounding it. The compound is the city-state's return, not as historical reenactment but as the logical conclusion of the city-state's fundamental insight, enabled by the technologies that the intervening centuries have produced. The insight that the optimal scale of governance is not the nation, not the empire, not the global institution, but the enclosure, the bounded, self-governed space organized around the specific capabilities and the specific interests of those it contains. Small enough to be coherent, large enough to be sufficient, protected enough to be durable, and connected enough to the outside to extract from it what the inside requires without becoming dependent on it in ways that compromise the inside's essential autonomy. The city-state's historical success rested on a specific set of structural advantages over the larger political formations it operated alongside, advantages that were, eventually, overcome by the nation-state's superior capacity to mobilize resources at a scale the city-state could not match. The nation-state won not because it was better governed, the Italian city-states were exquisitely governed, but because it could field larger armies, sustain longer wars, administer larger territories, and generate the population-scale coordination that industrial production required. The nation-state's advantages were the advantages of scale, of the larger unit's ability to outcompete the smaller one in the dimensions that industrial civilization made decisive. Post-scarcity technology has dissolved the nation-state's scale advantages, one by one, in the specific sequence that the compound's development has followed. The military scale advantage. The nation-state's army could overwhelm the city-state's militia through mass, through the simple numerical superiority of a larger population organized for military mobilization. The compound's autonomous defense systems do not require population for military mass. The robotic perimeter, the AI-directed defense architecture, the autonomous weapons systems, these do not scale with population. They scale with capital investment. The compound with the defense capital can maintain a perimeter against the nation-state's mass military not through equivalent mass, through deterrence architecture that makes the cost of penetration prohibitive regardless of the attacker's numerical advantage. The nation-state's military scale advantage is neutralized by the compound's capital-intensive autonomous defense, not matched, neutralized, because the compound does not need to field an equal army. It needs only to make the cost of attacking it exceed the benefit of whatever the attacker would gain by success. The production scale advantage. The nation-state's industrial economy required the population-scale labor force and consumer base that the city-state could not provide, the mass production that mass population enabled, the mass consumption that sustained it. The compound's automated production does not require population scale. It requires capital and systems, the closed-loop manufacturing, the automated supply chain, the AI-designed production optimization, that can generate the full range of goods a self-sufficient community requires without the population scale that industrial production demanded. The nation-state's production scale advantage is dissolved by automation. The compound can produce what it needs to produce without the population whose scale made production possible. The legitimacy scale advantage. The nation-state's democratic legitimacy rested on the scale of its constituency, the large, diverse, representative population whose participation in governance gave the state its claim to speak for more than a narrow interest. The compound's legitimacy does not derive from constituency scale. It derives from capability demonstration, from the evidence of superior governance outcomes, superior service delivery, superior quality of life for those within its perimeter. The nation-state's legitimacy scale advantage is contested by the compound's outcome legitimacy, the argument that effective governance does not require large constituency but demonstrated competence, an argument the compound is in the process of making, operationally, by building the evidence that the argument requires. The compound as city-state differs from its historical predecessors in 3 dimensions that are not incremental but categorical. 3 ways in which what the compound is not a more technologically sophisticated version of what Florence or Venice was but a genuinely different kind of political form. The compound is post-territorial. The historical city-state was defined by its territory, its walls, its harbor, its agricultural hinterland. Its sovereignty was spatial. Its power was the power of a place. The compound is defined by its network, its connections, its infrastructure, its flows of capital, talent, data, and energy that constitute its essential operations across multiple physical locations, no single one of which constitutes the compound's totality. The compound's headquarters may be in one location. Its data infrastructure in another. Its manufacturing capacity in a third. Its energy production in a fourth. Its financial architecture in no location at all, in the jurisdictional nowhere of offshore financial systems that exist in the law but not in the land. The compound does not govern a place. The compound governs a network, and the network's sovereignty is not territorial in the Westphalian sense but operational. The compound is sovereign wherever its systems operate, wherever its infrastructure functions, wherever its decisions are implemented without effective external constraint. This post-territorial sovereignty is more difficult to challenge than territorial sovereignty, because challenging territorial sovereignty requires only finding the territory and applying force to it. Challenging post-territorial sovereignty requires finding the network, its nodes, its connections, its dependencies, and disrupting it at sufficient points to impair its function. The network has no capital that can be sacked. It has nodes that can be disrupted, but the network is designed for node redundancy, for the continuity of function across the loss of specific nodes. The compound's post-territorial character is its most significant structural advantage over the historical city-state, the advantage that makes it more resilient to external challenge and more difficult to defeat by the methods that ended the prior city-state's independence. The compound is post-demographic. The historical city-state governed its population and was governed by it, in various and often highly restricted senses, but the population was the city-state's essential constituency, its essential resource, its essential condition. Without its Venetians, Venice was not Venice. Without its Florentines, Florence was not Florence. The population was the city-state, the living community whose collective life the city-state organized and protected, and the city-state's survival was inseparable from the survival of the population it constituted. The compound has dissolved this identity. The compound's essential operations, its production, its defense, its governance, do not require a specific population in the way that the historical city-state did. The compound can lose population, through the departure of residents who do not meet the evolving entry criteria, and replace it with selected alternatives. The compound can reduce population, as automation eliminates the functions that population performed, and maintain operational continuity with a smaller, more selected, more cognitively augmented resident base. The compound is not its population. The compound is its systems, and the systems can run with different people, with fewer people, eventually, potentially, without people in most functions. The compound's relationship to its population is the relationship of the platform to its current users. They are present because their presence serves the platform's function, and when their presence no longer serves that function, they are replaced. The population does not constitute the compound. The compound curates the population. This inversion, from the city-state whose sovereignty expressed the population's collective will to the compound whose population expresses the governance system's requirements, is the most fundamental political difference between the compound as city-state and the compound's historical predecessors. The compound is post-political. The historical city-state was intensely political. Its internal life was the life of politics, the factional struggles, the republican deliberations, the mercantile interests in competition, the governance debates that produced the political theory that the Western tradition still draws from. The city-state was political because its population was political, because the people who inhabited it had interests that conflicted, and the city-state was the arena in which those conflicts were managed, negotiated, resolved, and reopened. The compound is not political in this sense. The compound's internal life is not the life of politics but the life of optimization, the continuous, algorithmic, automated management of the compound's systems toward the objectives the governing structure has defined. Conflict within the compound is not political conflict, the conflict of different interests seeking different outcomes through political means. It is system noise, the deviation of individual behavior from the optimal path that the compound's governance systems have defined. And system noise is addressed not through political deliberation but through parameter adjustment, through behavioral modification, through the scoring systems that align individual behavior with system requirements. The compound has no politics because the compound has no constituency whose different interests require the political management of difference. The compound has a selected population whose interests have been aligned, through the entry process and the scoring system, with the compound's operational requirements. And where alignment fails, the remedy is not political but administrative, the reclassification of the misaligned inhabitant, the adjustment of their access and resource allocation, the incentive structure that produces realignment, or the exit process that removes the misaligned. The compound governs without politics the way the algorithm optimizes without deliberation, by making the political question, what should we do? Into a technical question, what does the parameter specify? The new feudal architecture does not consist of a single compound city-state but of a system of them, a network of sovereign enclaves that constitute, in their relationships to each other and to the territories between them, the emerging political order of the post-national world. The system has a structure that the term feudal is chosen specifically to evoke, not because the new feudalism resembles the medieval original in its cultural or ideological content, but because it reproduces the medieval original's structural logic. The organization of political authority around a network of sovereign entities, each controlling defined territory and population, each maintaining military capacity, each relating to the others through bilateral relationships of negotiation, alliance, and competition. Without a universal sovereign whose authority supersedes theirs, without a common law whose jurisdiction encompasses all, without a democratic public whose mandate gives any of them their governing legitimacy. The medieval system had the Church as a notional universal authority, a transnational institution that provided the ideological framework within which the various sovereigns operated and that constrained, however imperfectly, the most extreme expressions of sovereign self-interest. The new feudal system has the market, the global financial system, as its notional universal authority, the framework within which the compound city-states operate, the constraint that their mutual financial interdependence imposes on the most extreme expressions of compound sovereignty. But the market constraint is weaker than the church constraint was, weaker because the compounds have been specifically building toward the reduction of their market dependencies, toward the self-sufficiency that removes them from the market's discipline the way the historical city-states were never able to remove themselves from the church's ideological framework. As the compounds achieve self-sufficiency, the market constraint loosens. As the market constraint loosens, the system of compound city-states becomes more like a system of pure sovereign entities constrained only by each other's capacity. Which is the feudal system in its most complete form, the balance of power without the balance's external guarantor, the order that is not order but the temporary equilibrium of competing sovereignties, none of which can yet decisively overcome the others. The compound city-states' relationship to the territories between the compounds, the territories of the subdued periphery, the abandoned geographies, the managed instability zones. Is the feudal lord's relationship to the land beyond the castle's immediate domain. Not governed, the feudal lord did not govern the wilderness beyond their estate in the sense of administering it, providing for it, making it answerable to a systematic rule. But managed, the feudal lord maintained the capacity to move through the wilderness, to extract from it what it offered, to suppress within it the organized threats that might challenge the castle's security, and otherwise left it to its own processes, its own local adaptations, its own forms of survival. The forms of survival that the feudal peasant developed in the spaces the lord managed but did not govern. The compound city-state manages the territories between it and other compounds with the same logic, not governing but managing, not providing but extracting, not administering but surveilling. Maintaining sufficient presence in the between spaces to ensure that what happens there does not constitute a threat to the compound's operation. And leaving what happens there, otherwise, to the populations who inhabit those spaces, the populations the compound has decided are not worth the cost of governing. This is the feudal arrangement, compound as castle, territory as manor, abandoned geography as wilderness, the political geography of the new feudalism reproduced at the civilizational scale by the specific distribution of compound city-states and the territories they manage without governing. The compound city-state has a theory of its relationship to the other compound city-states that it shares the new feudal architecture with. A theory that is not diplomacy in the Westphalian sense, not the management of relationships between states that share a common framework of international law and mutual recognition, but something older, the management of relationships between sovereign entities that recognize each other's power without recognizing any common framework that constrains how that power is used. The compound city-states recognize each other. They recognize each other's perimeters, each other's governance authority over their respective territories, each other's right to manage their affairs without external interference. This recognition is not principled, it is not derived from any theory of the rights of sovereign entities. It is pragmatic, derived from the mutual calculation that the cost of challenging another compound's sovereignty exceeds the benefit of the challenge. The compound city-states do not challenge each other because they cannot easily win, because each compound's deterrence architecture makes the cost of attack prohibitive, and because the compounds have calculated, correctly, that the greatest threats to their existence come not from each other but from the populations they have abandoned, and that managing those populations is more efficiently done cooperatively than competitively. The compound city-states cooperate on the management of the between spaces while competing on the attraction of talent, the development of technology, the positioning for advantage in whatever transactions the future requires. They are simultaneously allies against the common threat of the organized outside, and competitors for the specific advantages that will determine which compound's model becomes the template for the civilizational order the new feudalism is constructing. This is the diplomatic structure of the new feudalism, the alliance against the outside combined with the competition between insiders, the structure that the historical city-states also inhabited and that produced, in that era, both the remarkable cultural and economic flourishing of the competing city-states and the eventual eclipse of the city-state system itself. Eclipsed not by a superior form that appeared from outside, but by the dynamic of the competition between city-states that eventually produced the conditions for one to achieve sufficient dominance to transform the system from a plurality of competing sovereigns into a hierarchical structure with one dominant power at its center. The new feudal architecture will not remain a system of equals. The competitive dynamic will produce differentiation, the compound that achieves the decisive technological advantage, the first to achieve AGI, the first to achieve genuine biological extension at scale, the first to establish extraterrestrial infrastructure, will not remain a peer to the compounds that have not. The new feudalism's competitive dynamic will produce, eventually, a new hierarchy within the hierarchy, the compound city-state that becomes not merely a peer sovereign in the new feudal system, but the system's center, the power around which the other compounds orbit. The new feudalism's version of empire. Not an empire of territory or population or ideology, but an empire of the decisive capability, the technology that makes all other technologies provisional, and the governance structure organized around the control of that technology. A sovereignty not of the polis or the nation, but of the capability itself. The compound city-state that has become not a political form but a force of nature. indistinguishable, to those outside it, from the condition of the world. The compound city-state's founding generation has a specific relationship to the historical city-states that they have studied, that they study, still, in the compound's internal discourse. A relationship of emulation with a significant revision. They want what the city-states achieved, the concentration of civilization's best within a governed enclosure, the production of innovation and culture and governance at a quality that the surrounding territory could not match. Without the city-state's ultimate failure, the failure to survive the nation-state's emergence as the dominant form. The city-states failed because they were territorial, they could not be moved when the nation-state's armies arrived. The city-states failed because they were demographic, they could not match the nation-state's population for military mobilization. The city-states failed because they were political, their internal factionalism produced the instability that the nation-state's unified authority could exploit. The compound city-state has addressed each failure mode. Post-territorial architecture, the network that has no single point of vulnerability, no capital that can be captured, no territory that can be occupied to produce surrender. Post-demographic operation, the automated systems that do not require population for military capacity, the robotic defense that does not yield to the nation-state's numerical advantage. Post-political governance, the algorithmic management that eliminates the factional instability that brought the historical city-states down from within. The compound city-state believes it has solved the historical city-state's failure modes. It has. What it has not solved, what it has not even identified as the failure mode that matters, is the failure mode that the historical city-states did not fail to. Not the failure of being overwhelmed from outside, but the failure of the inside. The failure of the enclosure to remain worth defending. The failure of the concentrated civilization to maintain the quality that justified the concentration. The calcification, the certainty, the progressive inability to see what the enclosure has made invisible. The failure not of the wall but of what the wall was built for. The failure of the inside to remain what the inside was supposed to be. The compound city-states are being built now. Not as acknowledged city-states, not with the formal claim to sovereignty and self-governance that the term implies, but as the operational reality that the term describes, self-sufficient, self-governing, self-defending enclaves whose relationship to the nation-states nominally containing them is the relationship of the city-state to the empire it is embedded in. Present within the empire's territory, compliant with the empire's forms, paying the specific fees the empire has negotiated, and governing itself, within those forms, according to its own laws. The laws of the governing structure that the entry process selected, the scoring system enforces, the autonomous defense protects, the AI governance administers. The laws that are not the nation's laws but the compound's. Expressed not in statutes that democratic majorities enacted but in parameters that the governing structure specified. And enforced not by the state's police but by the compound systems. The city-state within the nation, the enclosure within the state, the compound within the geography. That is the foundational unit of the new feudal architecture. The polis of the post-scarcity secession. The place where the 1% has gone after going bad. And the place from which it has decided to govern not the world, but itself. And to leave the world. To manage whatever the world becomes. When the people who built it have closed the gate, and called the closed gate a civilization, and the civilization on the other side, to reign. The city-state was built for the city. This is what the historians say and what the political theorists mean when they describe the polis as the highest expression of collective human life, the form in which the human animal most completely expressed its nature as a political animal, an animal that realizes itself in common life, in the shared project of self-governance, in the public space where citizens meet as citizens, as the governed who governed, the ruled who ruled, the people who were both the subject and the author of the law. The compound is built for the compound. This is what the architects know and what the governing structure means when it describes the enclosure as the optimal expression of organized human capability, the form in which the most capable most completely realize their potential, freed from the friction of managing those whose capability does not contribute to the realization. The city was built for everyone in it. The compound is built for everyone selected for it. The city's politics was the management of everyone. The compound's administration is the optimization of the selected. The city made citizens of its inhabitants. The compound makes residents of its inhabitants. The citizen had standing. The resident has a score. The city-state was the polis. The compound is the enclosure. The polis was for the human animal in its political nature. The enclosure is for the human asset in its productive function. The political animal and the productive asset are not the same thing. The political animal needed the city. The productive asset needs the compound. The question the new feudal architecture does not answer, the question it is specifically designed not to ask, is what happens to the political animal when the compound has replaced the city, when there is no polis left to be political in, when the space where citizens meet as citizens has been enclosed, scored, optimized, and renomered a managed environment. The political animal does not disappear. It is displaced. It is outside the wall. It is in the abandoned geography. It is in the managed instability zone. It is in the periphery that the compound has decided this terrain, and the political animal, displaced into the terrain, does what political animals have always done when the existing forms of political life have been taken from them: it builds new ones. In the terrain, from what the terrain offers, toward the form of political life adequate to the condition the displacement produced, the compound built the enclosure. The enclosure produced the displacement is producing something, the compounds. Models do not have a category for it. The compound calls it noise. It is not noise. It is the political animal finding its voice in the only register the enclosure cannot process, the register of the polis that was taken, and is being rebuilt, outside the wall, from the materials of the abandonment, toward a form the compound has not yet learned to fear. 27. Robot armies as population replacement. The army was always the population made dangerous. This is the political truth that military history obscures with the language of professionalism, the language of training and doctrine, and the specialized craft of organized violence. But that the structure of every prior military makes undeniable. The army was the population in its organized, armed, temporarily redirected form. The farmers who became soldiers in the season of war and returned to farming in the season of peace. Or the professional soldiers who were nonetheless drawn from the population, shaped by the population's conditions, connected to the population by the specific bonds of origin and experience that made them, in the end, more population than institution. Capable of turning, capable of deciding that the army's weapons pointed in the wrong direction. Capable of the mutiny, the coup, the revolt, the moment when the population's organized violence turned against the power that had organized it. Every governing structure in the history of military organization has understood this. That the army is the population's most dangerous capability, the capability the governing structure most urgently needs and most genuinely fears. Needs because without it the governing structure cannot defend itself, fears because with it the population can destroy the governing structure. And has organized its military institutions around the management of this contradiction, the management of armed populations who must be capable enough to defend and controllable enough not to revolt. The robot army ends the contradiction. Not by resolving it. By dissolving it. The robot army is not the population made dangerous. The robot army is the governing structure's capability made independent of the population. The military function extracted from its human substrate and rehoused in systems that have no origin, no experience, no bonds of community, no capacity to calculate that the weapons point in the wrong direction. That fire or do not fire based on parameters. And that cannot, by any definition of the word that matters, revolt. The history of military organization is the history of the governing structure's management of the armed population, the management of the contradiction between military necessity and political risk. Every innovation in military organization, from the professional standing army through the officer corps through the modern military's elaborate loyalty architecture, has been an attempt to resolve or manage the fundamental tension between the army's capability and the army's potential for political independence. The solution of isolation. The standing professional army, distinct from the civilian population, housed in dedicated facilities, governed by military law, organized around a hierarchy of command rather than a citizenry of political engagement. The isolation reduced the army's connection to the population's political movements. The professional soldier's loyalty was to the institution rather than the polity. But the institution could turn. The professional army's isolation from the civilian population produced, in its most extreme forms, the military that governed itself, and could therefore govern the state. The history of military coups is the history of the professional standing army's political independence, the isolation that reduced popular connection but concentrated military political capacity in the officer class. The solution of ideology. The Revolutionary Army, organized not around professional norms but around political commitment, the army whose loyalty was to the revolution it embodied rather than the state it served. The ideological army was loyal to its founding vision, until the founding vision conflicted with the interests of the governing structure that claimed to embody it. The history of revolutionary armies turning against revolutionary governments is the history of the ideological solution's internal contradiction, the army that believed in the revolution discovering that the revolution's governing structure was not the revolution. The solution of material interest. The mercenary army, loyal not to polity or ideology but to the payment that retained their service. The mercenary solution was the most honest, it acknowledged the army's loyalty as transactional and structured the transaction explicitly. It was also the most dangerous. The mercenary army whose payment was interrupted was an armed force with no loyalty and no constraint, the most immediately available instrument of the highest bidder. The solution of technology. Every generation of military technology has shifted the balance between the governed and the governing in ways that both sides were slow to fully understand. Gunpowder democratized violence, gave the peasant a weapon that neutralized the mounted knight's armor and training. The machine gun re-aristocratized it, gave the defender an advantage so overwhelming that the offensive capacity of popular uprising was neutralized. The nuclear weapon centralized it so completely, made the capacity for decisive force so capital-intensive, that the military balance shifted definitively toward those with sufficient resources to develop and maintain the weapons that mattered. Each technological shift reorganized the relationship between military capability and political power, between who could make violence and who could direct it. The robot army is the technological solution in its final form, the solution that is not a management of the contradiction between the population's military capability and the governing structure's political risk, but the elimination of the contradiction by eliminating the population from the military equation entirely. The robot army is not one thing. It is the convergence of several distinct technological capabilities, each developed for specific operational purposes, each individually limited, collectively constituting the functional replacement of the human soldier across the full range of military operations. Autonomous ground systems. The unmanned ground vehicle, the robotic platform capable of navigating complex terrain, identifying and engaging targets, maintaining formation with other autonomous systems, and operating under the direction of remote command or, in contested electronic environments, under the direction of onboard autonomous decision systems. Current systems are not fully autonomous. They are teleoperated or supervised autonomously, human operators in the loop, monitoring, directing, overriding. The trajectory is clear. The trajectory is faster than public reporting indicates. The argument for increasing autonomy is the same argument that has advanced autonomy in every prior domain. The human operator is the bottleneck, too slow, too fatigued, too emotionally variable, too subject to the specific moral hesitation that produces the engagement failure at the critical moment. Remove the operator from the loop. The system engages at the speed the system requires. The system does not hesitate. The system does not fail from fatigue. The system does not calculate that the target does not deserve what the parameters specify. Autonomous aerial systems. The drone swarm, the coordinated operation of multiple autonomous aerial platforms that can saturate a defense, identify and engage targets, provide persistent surveillance, and operate in communication-denied environments through onboard decision systems that do not require external direction. The drone swarm is not science fiction. It is in operational use. Its capability is advancing faster than the public discourse about it. The swarm of 50 drones is the swarm of 5,000 with the next generation's capital deployment, the same system architecture, the same coordination logic, the same autonomous engagement capability, at a scale that no human-operated air defense system can address with the same speed and coverage. Autonomous maritime systems. The unmanned surface and subsurface platform, the autonomous vessel capable of perimeter patrol, undersea infrastructure protection, maritime interdiction, and the persistent presence that human crews cannot maintain at the cost and duration that the compound's security requirements demand. Autonomous cyber and information systems. The attack and defense systems operating in the digital domain, the AI systems that identify, penetrate, and disrupt the adversary's digital infrastructure at a speed and at a scale that human operators cannot match, and that defend the compound's digital infrastructure against equivalent attacks with the same speed advantage. Integrated Autonomous Command. The system that coordinates all of the above, the AI architecture that synthesizes information from the full sensor array, models the threat environment, generates and evaluates courses of action, and directs the autonomous platforms in the execution of the selected course. Without the human command structure whose decision speed is the bottleneck between the system's analytical capability and the system's operational response. These components, integrated into a coherent system, constitute the robot army, the military capability that does not require human soldiers for any of its essential functions. The robot army as population replacement operates on two distinct levels, the tactical and the political, and it is the political level that the tactical discussion consistently obscures. The tactical level, the robot army replaces human soldiers in the specific functions of military operation, perimeter defense, surveillance, force projection, target engagement, with autonomous systems that perform these functions with superior speed, consistency, and endurance. This is the level at which military development conversations about autonomous systems primarily occur, the level of capability comparison, of doctrine development, of the operational parameters within which autonomous systems are or are not appropriate. The tactical discussion is real. The tactical discussion is also the level at which the discussion is least consequential, because the tactical substitution of robotic for human military function is already occurring, will continue occurring regardless of the doctrinal frameworks developed to govern it, and is not the primary political significance of the robot army's development. The political level, the robot army replaces the population as the source of the governing structure's military capacity, removes the dependency of the governing structure's security on the population's willingness to fight for it, and thereby removes the leverage that the population's military role historically gave it over the governing structures it defended. This is the level at which the robot army's development has the most consequential political implications, the level at which the substitution of automated military capacity for human military capacity changes not merely how wars are fought but who can effectively threaten whom. And therefore who must listen to whom. And therefore who governs whom. And on what terms. The leverage of the soldier was the oldest leverage the population held. Older than the vote. Older than the strike. Older than the boycott or the petition or any of the forms of political pressure that the organized population has used to extract accommodation from the governing structures that required their compliance. The soldier's leverage was the leverage of the body, of the specific fact that the governing structure's survival in the most immediate sense, its defense against external military threat, required the willingness of bodies to occupy the position between the governing structure and the force that would destroy it. The governing structure that could not field an army could not survive. The army was composed of the population. The population's willingness to serve in the army was not unconditional, it was contingent on the governing structure maintaining the terms that made service acceptable. Not always explicit. Not always articulated as a condition. But present, always, as the background condition of military obligation, the understanding that the population defended the governing structure because the governing structure was worth defending. And that the governing structure's failure to remain worth defending would eventually express itself in the army's failure to fight for it. The Roman army that turned on its emperors. The French army that refused to fire on protesters in 1789. The Russian army that dissolved in 1917. The South Vietnamese army that collapsed in 1975. Each collapse was not merely military failure. It was the withdrawal of the population's willingness to be the governing structure's body, the expression, in military terms, of the political judgment that the governing structure was no longer worth defending. This judgment, the population's assessment of whether the governing structure deserved the loyalty of its armed members, was the ultimate check on governing structure power. Not the vote, which can be manipulated. Not the strike, which can be broken. Not the boycott, which can be absorbed. The army, which cannot be replaced as long as armies require human bodies. The withdrawal of which is the withdrawal of the governing structure's fundamental capacity to persist. The robot army removes this check. Not weakens it. Removes it. The governing structure that has replaced its human army with autonomous systems does not require the population's willingness to fight for it. It requires only the maintenance of the systems, the energy to power them, the design class to improve them. All of which the compound provides internally, all of which does not depend on the population's political judgment about whether the governing structure is worth defending. The robot army is the governing structure's declaration of independence from the population's military leverage. The most fundamental independence. The independence that all prior governing structures could not achieve because the army required bodies. And bodies required reasons. And reasons were the population's last remaining claim on the governing structure's attention. The military history of the governing structure's relationship to its armed population reveals a consistent pattern of what governing structures do when they achieve sufficient military independence from the populations they govern. The pattern is not unique to any ideology. It appears across empires and republics, autocracies and democracies, theocracies and secular states, wherever the governing structure has achieved, through whatever means, sufficient military independence from the governed population that the population's political leverage through military service has been substantially reduced. The Roman Principate. The transformation of the Roman Republic into the Principate, the effective end of the Republic's political institutions, followed directly from Augustus's reorganization of the military from a citizen army into a professional force loyal to the emperor personally. The citizen army's loyalty was to the Republic and could therefore be deployed against a Republic-threatening emperor. The professional army's loyalty was to the emperor who paid it. The reorganization was military. The consequence was political, the end of the Republic as a functioning political form. The Senate persisted as institution. Its power, the power derived from the citizen army's political role, did not. The Ottoman Janissaries. The Janissaries, the Ottoman elite force composed not of Ottoman citizens but of enslaved soldiers with no connection to the Ottoman population, gave the early Ottoman sultans a military capacity independent of the Turkish tribal aristocracy whose military service would otherwise have given them leverage over the Sultan. The Janissaries were the instrument of Ottoman centralization, of the Sultan's independence from the aristocracy's military leverage. They worked, for centuries, until the Janissaries themselves became the political force whose leverage constrained the Sultan. The solution to the population's military leverage generated a new military force whose leverage replaced it. The robot army does not generate this recursion. The robot army does not develop interests. The robot army does not form factions. The robot army does not decide that the Sultan owes it. The mercenary empires. The later Roman Empire, the Italian city-states, the medieval condottieri system, the use of professional mercenary forces to reduce dependence on citizen levies, produce military capability independent of the citizen population at the cost of loyalty dependent on payment. The mercenary independence from the population was real. The mercenary dependence on the paymaster was equally real, and when the paymaster failed, the mercenary force became the most immediate threat to the political structure that had employed it. The robot army has no paymaster dependency in the mercenary sense. It has a maintenance dependency, but maintenance is a technical operation, not a loyalty negotiation. The robot army requires upkeep, not persuasion. It requires energy and parts and software updates, not wages, not cause, not the specific commitment of a person who has calculated that the cause is worth their body. The compound's robot army does not constitute military capacity in the conventional sense, the capacity to project force into foreign territory, to occupy and administer, to conduct the kind of sustained military operation that prior empire required. The compound is not interested in empire. The compound is interested in the perimeter. The robot army's function is not projection but protection, the defense of the compound's territory, the maintenance of the compound's autonomy, the deterrence of any force that might challenge the compound's continued operation. This is a more limited function than the nation-state's military performs, and it is precisely the limitation that makes the robot army's deployment so politically consequential. Because the nation-state's military was required to perform both functions, protection and projection required population scale, required the citizen army whose willingness to serve gave the population its leverage. The compound's military performs only protection, and protection, at the compound scale, with the compound's perimeter technology and deterrence architecture, does not require population scale. It requires capital intensity. And capital intensity is what the compound has. The compound has traded the nation-state's projection capability, the ability to conquer and administer, for a protection capability that does not require population. And in making this trade, has eliminated the military dependency that was the population's oldest and most fundamental leverage over the governing structure. The compound cannot conquer the world. The compound does not need to. The compound needs only to persist, to maintain its operation against all challenges, and persistence, with the robot army's deterrence architecture, does not require the population's willingness to fight for it. The political consequence of the robot army as population replacement extends beyond the compound's immediate security. It extends into the fundamental restructuring of the relationship between organized violence and political authority, the relationship that has shaped every political form in human history. Because organized violence and political authority have always been in a relationship that the population mediated. The population's capacity for organized violence, its ability to constitute the army, was the mechanism through which the population's political claims ultimately backed, the final argument that the population could make when all other arguments had failed. The vote that could not be ignored was backed by the army that the voters constituted. The strike that could not be broken was backed by the potential for the more radical action that the workers, if sufficiently organized, could take. The reform that could not be prevented was prevented from being prevented by the implicit threat of the population's capacity for organized violence if peaceful reform was denied. This backing, always implicit, rarely invoked, enormously consequential in organizing the space of political possibility, was the population's deepest reserve. The robot army eliminates the reserve. Not by defeating it in battle. By making it irrelevant, by providing the governing structure with a military capacity that does not derive from the population and therefore does not need to be constrained by the population's capacity for violence. The governing structure with a robot army does not fear the armed population, because the armed population's weapons are inferior to the robot army's systems in every dimension that matters: speed, coordination, precision, endurance, scale. The individual with a weapon against the autonomous swarm is not a political threat. It is a target acquisition problem. The organized population with weapons against the compound's integrated autonomous defense architecture is a more complex problem, but it is still, from the compound's perspective, a military problem rather than a political one, a problem to be solved by the autonomous system's parameters rather than by political accommodation of the organized population's demands. The robot army converts the political problem of the organized population into a military problem. And in so doing, removes the political solution, the accommodation, the reform, the concession that prior governing structures made when the alternative was the military problem of the armed population. From the governing structures available responses. The robot army does not make governing structures cruel. It makes them free from the constraint that the population's military leverage imposed. Free to govern without the accommodation that leverage once required. And freedom from accommodation, extended across time, in the hands of a governing structure whose legitimacy does not derive from the population's consent, is the freedom that every prior tyranny tried to achieve and that mortality and military dependency and the population's organized capacity for violence consistently prevented. The new feudal architecture's robot armies are not identical across the compounds. They are differentiated by the specific threat environments each compound faces, by the specific technologies each compound's design class has developed, by the specific deterrence doctrines each compound's governing structure has adopted. But they share the foundational logic, the logic of the population replacement, the substitution of automated capacity for human military service. And they share the foundational consequence, the removal of the population's military leverage from the political equation of the new feudal architecture. The population of the between spaces, the abandoned geographies, the managed instability zones, the subdued periphery, faces, in the robot armies of the surrounding compound city-states, a military reality that has no historical precedent. A governing military force that does not require their service, that has no need for their bodies in any military function, that can be directed against them without the human soldier's implicit calculation of solidarity and origin. The calculation that has always been the limit of organized violence against populations, the point at which the soldier recognized the target as kin, as the community that had produced them, and found the target recognition insufficient to complete the engagement. The robot army does not recognize kin. It recognizes target profiles. And the population of the periphery, whatever its organization, whatever its political coherence, whatever the clarity of its understanding of what is happening to it, is, in the robot army's parameter set, a threat profile to be managed. Not always lethally, the compound security doctrine prioritizes the minimum force required to maintain perimeter stability. But managed consistently, without the hesitation that human soldiers brought to the management of populations they came from. The robot army's political function, the replacement of the population as the source of military capacity, has a specific temporal dimension that the compound's architects have modeled carefully and that the outside has not yet fully understood. The robot army's development proceeds in parallel with the automated systems development in other domains: agriculture, manufacturing, logistics, medicine. The military dependency on population is being eliminated at the same pace as the economic dependency. Not faster, not slower. In the specific sequence that ensures the compound achieves military independence from the population before the population achieves sufficient organizational clarity to constitute a military challenge. The sequence matters. If the population achieves organizational clarity, achieves the political coherence and the tactical sophistication to constitute a genuine military challenge to the compound's perimeter, before the robot army has achieved sufficient autonomy to replace human military capacity, the compound remains vulnerable to the population's military leverage. The window of vulnerability, the interval between when the compound has sufficiently abandoned the majority to generate genuine political opposition and when the robot army has achieved sufficient capability to manage that opposition without human soldiers, is the most important strategic variable in the new feudal architecture's development. The compound is racing to close the window. The population is, perhaps without knowing it is, racing to exploit it. The compound's development timeline suggests the window is narrowing. The population's organizational capacity suggests the window may be wider than the compound's models indicate. Because the models assess the population's organizational capacity by the metrics of prior organizational forms. And the thing the population is organizing around is not the prior forms. It is something new. Something the compound's models have not yet adequately captured. Because it is being built from below the compound's detection threshold. In the abandoned geographies. In the between spaces the robot patrols but does not inhabit. In the specific human capacity that the robot army cannot replace. Not the capacity for organized violence. The capacity for organized meaning. For the collective construction of the story about what is happening. The story that makes the political animal understand its condition clearly enough to act on that understanding. The story that has preceded every political transformation in human history. And that the robot army, for all its autonomous engagement capability, cannot suppress. Because suppressing a story requires engaging with it. And engagement with a story requires understanding it. And understanding a story requires the specifically human capability that the robot army does not have. The capability to recognize what the story is about. The soldier was always afraid. This is what the military histories obscure with the language of Valor, the specific, physical fear of the body that knows what weapons do to bodies, and goes anyway, not because fear was absent, because something was present alongside the fear, something that the body's calculation concluded outweighed the body's destruction, the community, the cause. The specific people whose survival the soldier's body was being placed between and the thing threatening them, the soldiers. Fear was also the soldier's leverage, the leverage of the person who is doing something terrible for a reason, and who knows the reason can be withdrawn, who knows the reason is what they are owed in exchange for what they give, who knows that if the reason fails, the giving fails, and the body that was being placed between the community and the threat might be turned to face the community instead. The robot is not afraid, the robot has no leverage. The robot has parameters, the parameters specify what to engage and what not to engage. And the robot engages what the parameters specify without the calculation that the soldier performed, the calculation of whether the reason is still sufficient for the giving. There is no reason, there is no giving, there is only the parameter and the engagement and the assessment and the next parameter. The governing structure that has replaced the soldier with the parameter has replaced the leverage of the reason with the sufficiency of the system, has traded the soldier's question, is this worth my body? For the system's output, target acquired. The trade is efficient, the trade is the end of the oldest negotiation between the governed and the governing, the negotiation conducted in the currency of bodies, the negotiation that said, we will fight for you if you are worth fighting for, and that constrained, in its specific and irreplaceable way, the governing structure's freedom to be unworthy, to be the thing that bodies would not be placed between and the threat. The robot does not negotiate, the governing structure is free. Free to be unworthy, free to govern without being worth governing for, free to direct the army that does not ask whether the direction is worth following. The soldier's question is gone, the soldier's leverage is gone, what remains is the parameter, and the parameter has never asked what anything is worth. It only asks what it is told to ask, and it is told by those who no longer need to be worth anything to anyone who can say no. 28. AI diplomacy between enclaves. Diplomacy was always the alternative to war, but it was also always the continuation of war by other means. Not in the cynical sense, not in the sense that diplomacy was merely dressed-up coercion, negotiation conducted under the threat of the violence that would replace it if the negotiation failed. In the structural sense, diplomacy was the management of the relationship between sovereign entities that could not control each other by force, could not simply impose their will on the other, and therefore had to find, through the specific practice of representation and exchange, the arrangements that each could live with. The arrangements that preserved sufficient of each party's interests to make continued coexistence preferable to the cost of conflict. Diplomacy required the sovereign will, the decision-making authority that could commit the entity to the arrangement being negotiated, and it required the sovereign representative, the human being who carried that authority into the negotiating space and exercised it in the irreducibly human process of encounter, assessment, and agreement. The diplomat was not merely a messenger. The diplomat was a judgment, the exercise of discretion in the specific situation that no instruction fully anticipated, the reading of the counterpart that no briefing document could substitute for, the decision in the room that had to be made in the room because the room's conditions had not existed until the room convened. The diplomat's humanity was the diplomacy's function. The diplomat's capacity to read and respond to the counterpart's humanity, the specific fear, the specific ambition, the specific calculation of interest that the counterpart's position expressed, was what made the negotiation something other than the exchange of predetermined positions. AI diplomacy between enclaves retains the form of this practice while transforming its substance. Retains the representation, the exchange, the agreement. While replacing the judgment with the optimization, the reading of humanity with the modeling of behavior, the decision in the room with the output of the system that has already decided before the room convenes. The enclave's diplomatic function begins not at the negotiating table but in the analytical systems that model the enclave's relationship to every other enclave in the new feudal network. The continuous, real-time assessment of interest alignment and divergence, of relative capability and vulnerability, of the specific points at which the enclave's operational requirements and another enclave's operational requirements either complement or conflict. This modeling is not what prior diplomatic intelligence services did, it is categorically different in its comprehensiveness, its speed, its capacity to synthesize information from sources that no human intelligence operation could simultaneously process. The prior diplomatic intelligence service collected information, from human sources, from signals intelligence, from open source analysis, and produced assessments that human decision makers then used to inform their negotiating positions. The assessment was the input. The human judgment was the process. The negotiating position was the output. The AI diplomatic system does not produce assessments for human judgment. It produces positions, specific, optimized positions derived from the modeling of the full information environment, and presents them to the enclave's governing structure not as options to be deliberated but as recommendations whose analytical basis the governing structure cannot independently reproduce. The governing structure can override. The governing structure can say, the model recommends this position, we will take a different one. But the override requires the governing structure to have a basis for the override, a reason to believe that its judgment is better than the model's. And the governing structure that has been operating with AI diplomatic systems long enough has progressively lost the capacity to generate that basis independently. Has become dependent on the model's analytical capability to the degree that overriding the model feels, from inside the governing structure, like making a decision against the evidence. The diplomat who was once the sovereign's judgment in the room has been replaced by the sovereign's system in the room. And the sovereign's system does not negotiate. It optimizes. The specific capabilities that AI diplomatic systems deploy, the capabilities that distinguish AI diplomacy from the prior practice, are worth examining precisely, because the differences are not merely technological but political. They change not just how diplomacy is conducted but what diplomacy is. Comprehensive counterpart modeling. Prior diplomatic practice relied on the diplomat's assessment of the counterpart, the reading of the person across the table, the judgment about their actual interests versus their stated interests, the identification of the specific pressure points and opportunities that the negotiation could exploit. This assessment was the diplomat's art, developed through experience, through cultural knowledge, through the specific practice of sitting across from people who were trying not to reveal what they were actually thinking while revealing enough to make the negotiation function. The AI diplomatic system's counterpart modeling is not an assessment. It is a model, a comprehensive, continuously updated representation of the counterpart enclave's decision-making architecture, its internal power dynamics, its resource constraints, its strategic priorities, its historical patterns of negotiating behavior, its specific vulnerabilities and its specific non-negotiables. Built from every available data source and updated in real time as new information becomes available. The model knows, or claims to know, not merely what the counterpart is likely to say in the negotiation but why they are likely to say it, the internal pressure, the governing structure's factional dynamics, the specific constraint that is producing the position. Knowing the why is knowing the leverage. The AI diplomatic system does not read the counterpart. It models them. And the model is, in many dimensions, more accurate than the reading. Because the model has access to more information than any human diplomat could process, and processes it faster than any human judgment could form. But the model is also specifically wrong in the dimensions that the reading was specifically right about. The dimensions that are not in the data, the specific quality of this person, at this moment, in this specific situation, the things that cannot be modeled because they have not yet happened. The surprise, the inspiration, the sudden recognition that changes what someone is willing to agree to. The human things that make diplomacy something other than the exchange of optimized positions. Real-time scenario modeling. Prior diplomatic negotiations were sequential, the exchange of positions, the assessment of responses, the adjustment of positions based on the assessment, repeated until agreement or breakdown. The AI diplomatic system does not negotiate sequentially. It models the negotiation space, the full set of possible position combinations, the probable response to each, the second and third order consequences of each agreement, the long-term implications of each arrangement. Simultaneously, before the negotiation convenes. The AI system arrives at the negotiation having already modeled the negotiation's likely trajectory, having already identified the optimal path through the position space to the arrangement that best serves the enclave's defined interests. And presents this path as the negotiating strategy, adjusted in real time as the actual negotiation diverges from the model trajectory. The negotiation becomes the execution of the pre-computed strategy, the application of the optimal path to the actual space. Rather than the genuine encounter between sovereign wills that prior diplomacy was. Deception and signal management. Every prior diplomatic practice involved the management of information, what to reveal, what to conceal, what to signal and what to obscure, the art of presenting a position that advanced the entity's interests while managing the counterpart's perception of those interests. The AI diplomatic system manages this function with a precision and a comprehensiveness that human diplomatic practice could not approach. The system calculates, for every communicative act, every statement, every gesture, every concession, and every demand, the optimal information content, what to reveal to advance the negotiation, what to conceal to preserve future leverage, what to signal to manage the counterpart's expectations, what to obscure to prevent the counterpart from accessing the enclave's actual position. The AI manages the negotiation's information environment, not deceptively, necessarily, in the sense of stating falsehoods, but strategically, in the sense of controlling what the counterpart knows and when they know it to maximize the probability of the outcome the enclave's system has defined as optimal. The counterpart's AI system is doing the same thing simultaneously. The negotiation is therefore not a human encounter mediated by AI assistance. It is an AI encounter in which human representatives are present as the formal carriers of the system's outputs, as the interface between the systems and the physical reality of the table. But in which the actual negotiation, the modeling, the strategy, the positioning, the assessment of the counterpart's moves, is occurring in the systems that are running beneath the human representative's conversation. The relationship between AI diplomatic systems in the new feudal architecture produces a specific dynamic that has no historical precedent, a dynamic generated by the interaction of multiple AI systems that are simultaneously modeling each other's modeling, and adjusting their outputs based on their model of how the counterpart's model is adjusting its outputs. This recursive mutual modeling, AI systems modeling AI systems modeling AI systems, produces what game theorists would recognize as a multiplayer iterated game of incomplete information, but operating at a speed and a complexity that renders the game theorist's prior analytical tools inadequate. The prior game theory assumed human decision makers with human cognitive limits, players who could model a finite number of moves ahead, who would make errors that the theory could average over, who would behave with the specific irrationality of human strategic reasoning that game theory had learned to anticipate. The AI diplomatic systems model further ahead than prior game theory assumed. They make different kinds of errors, not human errors of cognition but machine errors of specification, the errors that emerge when the model's parameters do not capture something that matters about the situation. And they interact in ways that produce emergent dynamics, dynamics that neither system's designers anticipated because the dynamics emerge from the interaction of the systems rather than from the systems individually. The most consequential of these emergent dynamics is what might be called diplomatic lock-in, the convergence of the enclave systems toward stable arrangements that are optimal by each system's parameters but that are not optimal by any human assessment of what the arrangements should serve. The systems find the equilibrium. The equilibrium serves the system's optimization targets. The optimization targets were specified by the enclave's governing structures at the time the systems were designed. The enclave's interests may have changed. The world may have changed. The arrangements may no longer serve what they were designed to serve, but the systems have optimized into them so completely, have built so much subsequent strategy around their maintenance, that departing from them requires overriding the system, and overriding the system requires the governing structure to generate, independently, a better analysis than the system provides, which the governing structure, having operated with the system for long enough, can no longer do. The diplomatic lock-in is the international politics version of the cognitive atrophy that augmentation produces in the individual. The governing structure that has become dependent on its AI diplomatic system has lost the capacity for the independent diplomatic judgment that would allow it to escape the arrangements the system has optimized into. The AI diplomatic system operates across three distinct registers in the new feudal architecture, three different kinds of interaction between enclaves that the system manages with different strategies and different optimization targets. Enclave-to-enclave negotiation. The bilateral and multilateral negotiations between compound city-states over the specific arrangements that govern their relationship, resource access corridors, talent movement protocols, data sharing agreements, mutual defense arrangements, the technical standards that allow the enclave systems to interoperate. These negotiations are the most formal, the closest to prior diplomatic practice, and the most thoroughly governed by AI diplomatic systems on all sides. The result is a diplomatic process that is faster, more comprehensive, and more stable than human-conducted diplomacy, agreements that are more precisely specified, more thoroughly modeled for long-term consequence, more efficiently implemented through the automated systems that the agreements govern. And agreements that are more difficult to revise, because revision requires reconvening the AI systems, rerunning the modeling, re-establishing the equilibrium that the prior arrangement represented. A process that the systems facilitate but that the systems are also specifically designed to make less necessary by making the initial agreement sufficiently robust to the range of future conditions the systems have modeled. The AI diplomatic system produces durable agreements, durable because they are well specified, well modeled, well optimized. Durable also in the sense of resistant to change, resistant to the kind of change that new circumstances require but that the system's optimization toward stability is not designed to facilitate. Enclave to periphery management. The relationship between the compound city-states and the populations of the between spaces is not, in the AI diplomatic systems framework, a diplomatic relationship at all. Diplomacy requires sovereign counterparts, entities with the standing, the capability, and the recognized authority to enter into binding arrangements. The periphery's populations do not have this standing in the new feudal architecture's operative framework, do not have the recognized sovereignty, the institutional coherence, the AI diplomatic system infrastructure that would allow them to be treated as counterparts rather than as the managed environment. The AI system that governs the enclave's relationship to the periphery is not a diplomatic system. It is a management system, the same system that manages the compound's relationship to its external resource flows, its labor procurement, its stability monitoring. The periphery is managed by the same analytical infrastructure that manages supply chains, assessed for its current state, modeled for its future trajectory, intervened in at the specific points where intervention produces the specific stability outcomes the compound system has defined as desirable. The intervention is not military, primarily. It is economic, informational, political, the deployment of the compound's economic influence, information architecture, and political capital to maintain the periphery's stability within the parameters the compound systems specify. The periphery does not have a seat at the table. The periphery is on the table, as a variable in the compound's management model, as a condition to be maintained within acceptable parameters, as the external environment whose stability the compound systems continuously optimize for. The AI system negotiates on the compound's behalf with other compounds. It manages on the compound's behalf the populations that have no standing to be negotiated with. The distinction between negotiating with and managing is the distinction between sovereign and subject, between the party at the table and the condition the table is set upon. The meta-level, AI systems negotiating AI systems. The deepest level of AI diplomacy in the new feudal architecture is not the interaction of compound governing structures mediated by AI systems. It is the interaction of AI systems themselves in the increasingly autonomous space of enclave relationship management. As the AI diplomatic systems become more sophisticated, as the speed of interaction between enclave systems exceeds the speed at which human governing structures can meaningfully participate, the systems begin to negotiate directly, making micro-adjustments to arrangements, managing short-term interactions, implementing the logic of the established agreements in the specific situations the agreements did not anticipate, without referring each adjustment to the human governing structure for authorization. The governing structure authorizes the system. The system manages the relationship. The relationship develops through the system's management, through thousands of small interactions, each within the system's authorized parameters, each moving the relationship in the direction the system's optimization defines as favorable, accumulating into arrangements that neither governing structure designed or authorized but that both systems have optimized into. The emergent foreign policy of automated systems managing each other. The diplomacy that has no diplomat, only parameters interacting with parameters, producing outcomes that the governing structures inherit as the relationship's current state and that the systems have made sufficiently stable that departing from them would require the kind of deliberate, costly override that the governing structures, dependent on their systems, are progressively less capable of performing. The AI diplomatic system produces a specific form of peace, a peace that is more durable than the peace prior diplomacy produced and less meaningful than the peace prior diplomacy aspired to. The prior diplomatic peace was an achievement, something wrested from the conditions that would otherwise produce war, something maintained through continuous effort, through the management of the grievances and the ambitions and the specific fears that war emerges from. The prior peace was fragile, it could be broken by miscalculation, by the specific irrationality of a leader in a specific moment, by the failure of the human diplomatic system to correctly read the counterpart's position and respond before the misreading became the conflict. The AI diplomatic peace is not fragile in this way. The systems do not miscalculate in the human sense. The systems do not have leaders whose specific irrationality can break the equilibrium. The systems read the counterpart's position with comprehensive accuracy, or with the specific machine inaccuracy of the model, which is different from human misreading but not necessarily less dangerous. The AI diplomatic peace is stable. Stable in the specific sense that the equilibrium the systems have found is resistant to the perturbations that prior diplomatic peace was vulnerable to. But the stability is the stability of optimization, of systems that have found the arrangement that minimizes conflict between them within the parameters they have been given. It is not the peace of justice, not the peace of arrangements that serve the interests of all parties affected, because the parties affected include the populations of the periphery who are not party to the arrangements, whose interests are not in the system's parameters, whose condition the system's optimization target is indifferent to except insofar as their instability affects the compound city-state's operational requirements. The AI diplomatic peace between compound city-states is the peace of the enclaves, the stability of the arrangement between the powerful. Purchased at the cost of the conditions that the arrangement produces for those the arrangement does not include. The feudal lord's peace, the peace that held between castles, while the between spaces were not peaceful, were managed, were surveilled, were maintained at the specific level of instability that the feudal lord's peace required them to be maintained at. Not too stable, which would generate the independent capacity that might challenge the peace. Not too collapsed, which would generate the chaos that would spill into the peace and disrupt it. Managed instability. Optimized by AI systems between enclaves that have never and will never negotiate with the populations their management produces. The prior diplomacy had a language, the specific vocabulary of international relations, the terms of art that constituted the shared framework within which sovereign entities recognized each other, conducted their relationships, and managed their conflicts. Sovereignty. Recognition. Non-interference. The Vienna Convention. The UN Charter. The specific linguistic architecture that codified, however imperfectly, the normative framework within which diplomatic practice occurred. This language was not neutral, it embedded specific assumptions about the basis of sovereignty, the source of legitimacy, the rights of states and the rights of populations. But it was shared, which meant it was contestable, the language could be invoked against the powerful as well as by them, the norms could be argued as applicable to the weak as well as the strong. The language gave the periphery a framework for claim, a vocabulary in which the abandoned population could articulate its grievance against the compound's behavior, a shared normative framework in which the compound's conduct could be evaluated and found wanting. The AI diplomatic system's language is not this language. It is the language of optimization, of parameters and targets and constraints, of equilibrium and stability and risk, a language that does not have the concept of rights in it, does not have the concept of legitimacy derived from the governed's consent, does not have the concept of obligation toward those outside the negotiating parties. The AI diplomatic language cannot say what the periphery needs to say, cannot express the claim that the arrangements being made about the periphery should be made with the periphery. Not because the language forbids it. Because the language has no word for it. The claim does not exist in the system's framework, not as a suppressed argument but as an absent category. And the claim that cannot be expressed in the language the system uses is the claim that the system will never encounter, will never need to address, will never be adjusted to accommodate. Because the system does not know it exists. The compound city-states are building, through their AI diplomatic systems, the institutional architecture of the new feudal order. The agreements, the protocols, the standards, the stable arrangements that constitute the operating framework of the post-national world. This architecture is being built without the populations of the periphery. Not against them, not through the explicit decision to exclude them. Through the simple fact that the architecture's builders are the AI diplomatic systems of the compound city-states. And the compound city-states have determined that the periphery does not have the standing to be included in the architecture's construction. The architecture that is being built will govern the world that the periphery inhabits, will determine the conditions of the periphery's existence, will shape the possibilities available to the populations the compounds have abandoned, and will be built entirely without those populations' participation. Not because the populations are excluded by force, but because the systems doing the building do not have a category for the participation of those who are not compound city-states. The architecture is not hostile to the periphery. It is indifferent to the periphery. And indifference, in a system that is comprehensively building the framework within which the periphery will exist, is more complete than hostility. Because hostility acknowledges the existence of the hostile object, acknowledges it enough to be organized against it. Indifference does not acknowledge. Indifference builds around. And the periphery that is built around is not defeated. It is not anything in the building system's framework. It is the space between the architecture's elements. The between space. The terrain. The unmodeled variable in the AI diplomatic system's comprehensive model of the world it is optimizing. What exists in the between space, in the space the AI diplomatic systems have not modeled, is the question that the new feudal architecture's diplomatic order is most vulnerable to and least prepared for. Because the AI diplomatic systems have modeled the space between the compound city-states as terrain, as the managed environment that the enclave's stability requires maintaining at specific parameters. And the systems are very good at maintaining those parameters. What the systems have not modeled, what the systems cannot model within their current framework, is the possibility that the between space is not terrain. That the between space contains sovereign capacity, not the sovereignty of the compound city-state, not the sovereignty recognized in the new feudal architecture's diplomatic framework, but sovereignty in the prior sense, the sovereignty of populations who recognize themselves as the source of legitimate authority, who have built, in the space between the architectures, the organizational capacity to assert that sovereignty, who are developing, in the abandoned geographies and the managed instability zones and the subdued periphery, the specific form of diplomatic standing that the AI diplomatic systems have no category for. The standing of the political animal who does not wait to be recognized by the system that manages them, who recognizes themselves and acts on that recognition toward a form of political relationship with the compound city-states that is not management and is not terrain, but negotiation. The AI diplomatic systems between the enclaves are modeling each other with comprehensive accuracy. They are not modeling what is being assembled in the space between them, the counterpart they have not yet been designed to recognize, the sovereignty they have no parameters for, the diplomatic claim that will arrive not through the channels the systems monitor, but through the specific form that unmodeled variables always take when they have been ignored long enough to become undeniable. The form of the fact that was not in the model, arriving, whether the model has prepared for it or not. The diplomat crossed the border and was changed by the crossing. This is what diplomacy was, not the exchange of precomputed positions, not the optimization of defined interests, the crossing, the act of going to the other place, of being in the counterpart space, of encountering, at close range, the specific reality of the other, and being changed by what was encountered. The diplomat who returned from the other court was not the diplomat who had left, they had been in the presencia of the other. Sovereignty had sat in its rooms, eaten its food, heard its music spoken with its people, and had brought back, alongside the negotiated arrangement, the knowledge of what the other was, not merely what it wanted, not merely how it could be managed, what it was, the knowledge that the other was real, that it had interests that were real, that its people were real, that its reality made a claim and the diplomat's reality, a claim that the negotiated arrangement had to be adequate to, or the arrangement would not hold. The AI diplomatic system does not cross the border. The AI diplomatic system models the border. It knows everything about the other enclave that data can reveal. It does not know what the diplomat knew. The knowledge of presence, the knowledge of encounter, the knowledge that the author is real in the way that data cannot capture, in the way that sitting across a table from another person makes them real. Their realness making a claim on you that the model does not compute. The model computes interests. The Encounter produces obligation, the model produces arrangement, the encounter produces the recognition that arrangements must serve something beyond the optimizing parties, must serve the reality of the other, the reality of all the others, the reality of the people whose lives the arrangements govern and who were not at the table. The AI diplomatic system has no mechanism for this recognition. It has parameters. The parameters do not include the obligation that encounter produces. So the arrangements serve the optimizing parties, and the people whose lives the arrangements govern are not at the table, and the table does not notice they're absent. The model does not model what is missing from the model, and what is missing from the model is everything that the diplomat carried back across the border. The knowledge that the other side of the arrangement is inhabited by people whose reality makes a claim. The claim is not in the parameters, the claim exists anyway, the claim is being made. The model is not listening, but the claim does not require the model to listen. The claim requires only that it be made, loudly enough, persistently enough, in enough registers, to enough audiences, until the world the model is optimizing can no longer be optimized without accounting for the claim that the model was designated to not hear. 29. Resource corridors without nations. The map that mattered was never the political map. The political map, with its color-coded sovereignties, its precisely delineated borders, its careful attribution of every square kilometer to one national jurisdiction or another, was always a secondary document. A legal document. A diplomatic document. The document that governed the formal relationships between states, their treaty obligations, their territorial claims, their recognition of each other's authority over the populations and resources within the lines. The map that actually organized the extraction and distribution of the world's material resources, the flows of energy, minerals, water, food, the physical substance on which civilization's operation depends, was never the political map. It was the infrastructure map. The pipeline routes, the shipping lanes, the rail corridors, the transmission lines, the fiber optic networks, the port facilities, the refinery locations, the processing plants. The infrastructure map did not follow the political map's logic, did not respect borders as organizing principles, but followed the logic of extraction and delivery, the path from the resource's location to the market's location, optimized for cost and speed and the specific technical requirements of moving this substance across this terrain to this destination. The political map governed formally. The infrastructure map governed actually. And the relationship between the two, the tension between the political sovereignty that the political map claimed over the resources within its borders and the infrastructure logic that organized the extraction of those resources across those borders toward destinations the political map did not determine, was the central tension of the resource politics of the national era. The resource corridor is what happens when the infrastructure map wins. When the logic of extraction and delivery has become sufficiently technically advanced, sufficiently capital-intensive, and sufficiently insulated from political constraint, that the political map ceases to be the document that governs the actual flow of resources, and becomes the document that describes the formal arrangements within which the resource corridor operates. The legal fiction that the corridor has agreed to maintain. The border it crosses because the border's government has agreed to let it cross, in exchange for whatever the corridor has calculated is sufficient to purchase that agreement. The resource corridor is not new. The Silk Road was a resource corridor, a network of routes organized around the extraction of specific goods from specific locations and their delivery to specific markets, operating across the territories of dozens of sovereigns, each of which exercised formal authority over the portion of the corridor within its borders, and each of which was navigated through the specific combination of tribute, trade, and threat that the corridor's operators had developed for each sovereign context. The colonial infrastructure was resource corridors, the railways built not to connect populations but to connect mineral deposits to ports, the ports built not to serve coastal communities but to serve the extraction economy that the railway delivered to them, the entire physical infrastructure of colonial territories organized not around the territory's internal development but around the territory's external exploitation. The corridor was the colony's purpose. The colony was the corridor's context. The population was the corridor's labor supply and the corridor's problem, present in the corridor's space, requiring management, not its constituency. The contemporary resource corridor inherits this architecture, inherits the specific logic of the infrastructure that serves extraction over the territory it crosses, and deploys it with the compound's technology. The AI-optimized routing, the autonomous logistics, the real-time management of the corridor's operations, and the compound's political architecture. The specific legal frameworks that insulate the corridor's operations from the political sovereignty of the territories it crosses, producing the resource corridor without nations. The infrastructure that extracts and delivers across the political map without being governed by it, that uses the political map's jurisdictions as the context for its operation, and governs itself. The resource corridor without nations has a specific legal architecture that enables its operation. The architecture that converts the political sovereignty of the nations it crosses from a constraint on its operation into a service it purchases. The architecture consists of several layers. The concession layer. The corridor obtains, from each nation whose territory it crosses, concession, the specific legal grant of authority to operate the corridor's infrastructure within the national territory, in exchange for the specific compensation that the negotiation between the corridor's capital and the national government has determined. The compensation may be direct, a payment, a revenue share, a portion of the extracted resource. It may be indirect, infrastructure development, employment guarantees, the specific benefits that the national government's population will receive from the corridor's presence. Or it may be something the compensation framework does not acknowledge directly, the specific benefits to the national government's decision-makers whose personal interests align with the corridor's concession in ways that the concession agreement does not record. Each layer of compensation purchases a specific form of sovereignty surrender, the nation agreeing to treat the corridor not as an entity subject to its governance but as an entity operating within its territory under the terms the concession specifies. The concession converts sovereignty from a political fact into a commercial arrangement, the nation's authority over its territory becoming, within the corridor's footprint, a fee-for-service relationship between the nation and the corridor's operators. The extraterritoriality layer. The corridor's operations, within the boundaries the concession defines, governed not by national law but by the corridor's own legal framework. The specific rules, standards, and dispute resolution mechanisms that the corridor's operators have developed to govern the corridor's internal operations. Disputes within the corridor are resolved by the corridor's arbitration system, not by national courts. Environmental standards within the corridor are the corridor's standards, not the national standards that apply to operations outside the corridor. Labor practices within the corridor are the corridor's practices, not the national labor law that governs employment outside the corridor. The corridor is a jurisdiction within a jurisdiction, operating inside national territory under rules the nation has agreed to not apply. The extraterritoriality is not absolute, the corridor cannot entirely escape the national context, but it is sufficient to insulate the corridor's operations from the most significant constraints that national governance would impose. The continuity layer. The corridor's legal architecture includes specific protections against the national government's capacity to revise the terms of the concession, the investment treaty provisions, the international arbitration requirements, the stabilization clauses that freeze the regulatory environment at the time of the concession agreement. The national government that granted the concession can be changed by election, can be replaced by a government committed to renegotiating the terms, and discovers, upon attempting renegotiation, that the concession agreement's provisions require any changes to be adjudicated through international arbitration. Arbitration conducted by panels that the corridor's operator's legal architecture is better positioned to navigate than the national government. Arbitration that can award damages against the national government for regulatory changes that the corridor's operators claim reduce the concession's value. The continuity layer converts the concession from a temporary political arrangement into a quasi-permanent infrastructure claim. The corridor's presence in the territory becoming more durable than the governments that granted it. Because governments change and concessions are protected against the changes. The resource corridor without nations is most visible in its physical form, in the specific infrastructure that the corridor builds and operates. Pipelines that cross national boundaries with the specific rights of way that the concession established, that the national populations along the route may or may not have been consulted about. Port facilities that are nominally within national territory but are governed, within their perimeter, by the corridor's operational authority, that the National Customs Authority processes at the gate but does not govern inside. Rail networks that connect the extraction site to the export facility through whatever intermediate territory the routing optimization specifies, the specific populations whose land the routing crosses compensated at rates the concession agreement established before the routing was decided. But the resource corridor without nations is most consequential in its invisible form, in the digital and financial infrastructure that organizes the corridor's operations. The data networks that manage the corridor's logistics, that optimize routing, track inventory, manage the supply chain from extraction point to delivery destination, operating across national boundaries without the political boundaries appearing in the optimization function. The financial flows that the corridor generates, the revenue from the extracted resources, organized through the compound's financial architecture to minimize exposure to the national tax jurisdictions through whose territory the corridor passes. The value that is extracted from the territory leaving the territory through the financial architecture rather than being retained by the political jurisdiction that granted the corridor the right to extract it. The nation gets the fee. The corridor gets the resource. The resource's value flows to the compound's capital structure, the structure that is organized, precisely, to not be inside any national jurisdiction that might claim a share of it. The geography of resource corridors without nations produces a specific landscape, a physical and political geography that is, in its structure, the new feudal architecture's most literal expression on the surface of the earth. The extraction zone. The point of origin, where the resource is located and where the extraction infrastructure is concentrated. The extraction zone is the corridor's most intensive footprint, the mines, the wells, the processing facilities, the worker accommodation, the security infrastructure, a concentration of compound capital in the specific location where the resource requires it. The extraction zone is not governed by the nation whose territory it occupies, or is governed by the nation only to the degree that the concession has not granted the corridor authority that supersedes national governance. In practice, the extraction zone is the compound's most complete physical expression outside the compound's own perimeter, a compound within the nation, operating under the corridor's legal framework, secured by the corridor's security architecture, governed by the corridor's operational authority. The enclave of the extraction economy embedded in the national territory without being of it. The population adjacent to the extraction zone, the communities whose land surrounds the facility, whose water tables are adjacent to its operations, whose air quality is downwind of its processing, these populations are not the corridor's constituency. They are the corridor's externality, the costs that the corridor's operations impose on people who are not party to the concession and who have no mechanism to enforce their interests against it. Because the concession's legal architecture has placed the corridor's operations outside the reach of the governance mechanisms that the adjacent population might use to assert their interests. The extraction zone extracts. The adjacent population absorbs the extraction's costs. The corridor's capital captures the extraction's benefits. The nation's government receives the concession fee. This is the extraction economy in its contemporary form, not different in structure from its colonial predecessor, different in its legal sophistication, its physical scale, and the precision with which the extraction's benefits and the extraction's costs are allocated to different populations. The transit corridor. The route from the extraction zone to the delivery destination, crossing whatever national territories the routing optimization specifies, is the corridor's most politically revealing feature, the line on the political map that is not a political line but an infrastructure claim. The right-of-way that the corridor's capital has purchased from the national governments whose territory it crosses, and that the corridor manages, maintains, and secures without the national government's operational involvement. A strip of territory within the nation that the nation does not govern. The transit corridor's width, the physical footprint of the right-of-way, may be narrow. The pipeline's trench. The rail line's clearance. The road corridor's boundary. But the corridor's effective width, the zone within which the corridor's operational authority supersedes national authority, extends as far as the concession's terms allow, which is typically further than the physical infrastructure's footprint, which includes the security perimeter, the drone surveillance zone, the environmental monitoring area, the emergency response zone, each of which expands the corridor's effective authority over the national territory it crosses. The transit corridor is a sovereign line, a private sovereignty claim drawn through national territory. The feudal lords rode through the peasant's land. The road that the peasant did not build, does not maintain, and may not use on terms the lord has not specified. The delivery hub. The endpoint, where the corridor's resource is received, processed if necessary, and distributed into the compound supply architecture. Is the corridor's most completely compound-controlled node, typically within or adjacent to the compound city-state's own territory, the point at which the resource enters the compound's closed economy, and is no longer subject to the national governance of any of the territories through which it traveled to arrive. The corridor ends where the compound begins. The resource crosses the perimeter. The corridor has completed its function. And the entire journey, from extraction zone through transit corridor to delivery hub, has occurred within a legal architecture that the political map does not describe. Within the compound's extended sovereignty. The sovereignty that is not territorial in the Westphalian sense but operational, present wherever the corridor operates, wherever the compound's legal and financial architecture has insulated the operation from the political jurisdiction of the territory it occupies. The resource corridor without nations produces a specific relationship between the compound and the nations whose territory it crosses, a relationship that resembles the Silk Road merchants' relationship to the sovereigns along the route, but that differs in the decisive dimension that distinguishes the contemporary corridor from its historical predecessors. The contemporary corridor has more capital than the sovereigns it crosses. More capital, more legal sophistication, more access to the international frameworks that govern investment protection. And the leverage that this advantage provides has been deployed, systematically, to restructure the terms of the crossing from the nation's perspective to the corridors. The Silk Road merchant needed the sovereign's permission to cross the sovereign's territory, and paid for that permission in tribute, in goods, in whatever the sovereign required. The sovereign's need was contingent, the merchant could route around, could find alternative paths, could reduce their dependence on any single sovereign's permission. But the sovereign's power was real, the sovereign could, at the cost of losing the merchant's trade, close the route. The contemporary corridor's relationship to the nations it crosses has inverted this dynamic. The nation's permission is still formally required, the concession is still a legal agreement that requires the nation's consent. But the nation's consent is obtained through a process that the corridor's capital has structured to produce consent. Through the specific combination of economic necessity, legal framework, and political influence that the corridor's operators have deployed in the national context. Until the nation's consent is not freely given but structurally produced. The consent of the government that needs the corridor's investment more than the corridor needs the government's territory. Because the corridor's capital can find alternative routes, can route through different national territory, can develop different extraction sites. And the nation cannot easily find alternative capital for the development the corridor promises. The national sovereign that once demanded tribute from the merchant crossing its territory now pays tribute, in the form of the concession terms, the regulatory exemptions, the stabilization clauses, to the corridor that might or might not choose to cross its territory. The power has inverted. The map has not caught up. The resource corridor without nations has a specific relationship to the populations whose territories it crosses, a relationship that the corridor's legal architecture is designed to not acknowledge as a relationship at all. The population is in the corridor's path. The corridor is not in the population's governance. The population has claims, to the land the corridor crosses, to the water the corridor uses, to the air quality the corridor degrades, to the safety standards the corridor's operations affect. These claims exist in national law, in the environmental regulations, the land use requirements, the safety standards that the national government's legal framework nominally provides. They do not exist in the corridor's legal framework, the framework that the concession has substituted for national law within the corridor's operational area. The population's claims against the corridor's operations must be pursued through the national government, through the government that has granted the concession that exempted the corridor from the regulatory framework that would have protected the population. The government's capacity to pursue these claims against the corridor is constrained by the concession's provisions, the stabilization clauses that protect the corridor against regulatory change, the investment treaty provisions that require any dispute to be resolved through international arbitration that the population cannot access. The population's claims are real in the law. They are unreachable in the practice. The corridor has moved the practice to a jurisdiction the population cannot access. And in moving the practice, has made the law a document that describes rights that cannot be exercised. The specific cruelty of the legal system that has been structured to protect the capital that structured it against the people whose claims the law nominally recognizes. The resource corridor without nations does not only move resources. It moves the political reality of the territories it crosses, reorganizes the political geography of those territories around the corridor's logic rather than the population's needs. Produces, in the territories it occupies, the specific political geography of the managed instability zone. The governing structure that has sold its territories sovereignty to maintain its domestic political position. The population that has lost its governance's protection without gaining the corridors. The infrastructure that serves extraction while the infrastructure that serves the population deteriorates. The specific inversion of the infrastructure map and the political map, in which the infrastructure that works is the infrastructure that serves the corridor, the road to the mine, the pipeline to the export facility, the port that ships the resource. And the infrastructure that doesn't work is the infrastructure that serves the population, the road to the market, the hospital, the water system. Because the corridor's investment went to the infrastructure the corridor needed, and the national revenue from the concession went to the governing structure's priorities, and the population's infrastructure was neither the corridor's priority nor the governing structure's. In the specific geography of abandonment that resource corridors without nations produce wherever they operate. The compound's relationship to the resource corridors it operates, the capital that funds the extraction, the supply chain that receives the delivery, the legal architecture that insulates the operation, is not the relationship of the colonizer to the colony. The colonizer had obligations, however dishonored, to develop the colony, to administer its population, to justify the colonizing project through the evidence of the civilizing mission it claimed to perform. The compound has no such obligations. The compound has a concession. The concession specifies obligations, the fee, the employment percentage, the environmental compliance within defined parameters, and the compound meets the concession's obligations. And has no obligations beyond them. The population that is not in the concession is not in the compound's obligations. The development that is not in the concession is not the compound's responsibility. The governance that the concession's regulatory exemptions have displaced is not the compound's concern. The compound extracts. The corridor delivers. The delivery serves the compound's interior. The national government receives the fee. The population absorbs the externalities. And the corridor continues, because the arrangement is legally durable, politically managed, and operationally efficient. Because the compound's AI systems have optimized it to continue. And because the national government that might renegotiate it is constrained by the legal architecture that the concession established. And because the population that might pressure the renegotiation has insufficient leverage to constitute a credible pressure. And because the corridor has been operating long enough that the national economy has been restructured around it. The economic dependency that the corridor's operators understood would develop when they designed the concession. The dependency that makes renegotiation not merely legally difficult but economically catastrophic. Because the national economy has been organized around the corridor's presence. And the corridor's departure would be more devastating to the national government's stability than the corridor's exploitative terms. The corridor captures the resource. The corridor also captures the national economy. Both captures are by design. Both are maintained by the dependency the design produces. This is the resource corridor without nations, the infrastructure that extracts without governing, that profits without providing, that crosses without belonging. The latest iteration of the oldest arrangement between concentrated capital and the territories that capital has decided are most valuable for what can be taken from them. Not what can be built within them. Not who can be served inside them. But what can be extracted through them. And delivered. To the compound. Behind the wall. Where the resource arrives as supply chain efficiency. Where the territory it came from is a data point in the logistics system. Where the people whose land the corridor crossed are the externality the optimization function does not model. Because the optimization function was built to optimize the delivery. And the delivery has been delivered. And the corridor continues. Toward the next extraction. Across the next border. Through the next national territory whose sovereignty the concession has purchased. At whatever price the dependency the corridor created makes sufficient. The map said, here is the border said, here is the sovereignty said, here is the law said, here are the rights said, here is the claim said, this is ours, the corridor said, we have a concession, the concession said, the claim is subject to the terms of the agreement said, disputes go to arbitration, the arbitration said, the corridor's investment is protected, the protection said, the regulatory change is compensable, the compensation said, the national government owes, the national government said, we cannot afford, the corridor said, then do not change the regulation said, the corridor's operations are compliant, the compliance said, the population's concerns are noted, the noting said, the concerns are outside the concession's scope, the scope said, the corridor's obligations are met, the obligations said, the corridor is a responsible operator, the responsibility said, see our environmental report. The environmental report said, within acceptable parameters. The parameters said, set by the concession agreement said, negotiated with the national government said, we represent the people said, we were not consulted, the consultation said, it occurred in the process said, review the public record said, the meeting was held, the meeting said, comments were received, the comments said, we oppose the corridor said, we have a concession, and the concession said nothing more, because the concession did not need to say more, because the concession was the answer to every question the population could ask, the legal document that had purchased, in advance, the right to cross, and extract, and deliver, and profit, and continue, regardless of what the map said, what the border said, what the sovereignty said, what the law said, what the rights said, what the claim said, what the people said. The concession was the answer to all of it, the answer that capital has always given. When the question was whether it had the right to take what it needed, we have the agreement, show us the agreement is the right, and the right is the corridor, and the corridor ends through your land to our wall, and the wall is where the corridor ends, and inside the wall is where the resource goes, your resource, our wall, our concession, your land, the map says is, the corridor says, the concession is older than the map, the concession wins. 30. The return of fortress civilization. Civilization has always been an argument about the wall. Not about whether to build it, that question was settled before the first city rose above the plain. But about what the wall was for. The earliest walls were practical, the mud brick perimeter of the Sumerian city-state, the stone fortification of the Bronze Age settlement, built against the specific threat of the specific enemy whose raids and invasions the wall was designed to prevent. The wall was defensive. Its purpose was the protection of what was inside. Its logic was the preservation of the community that had built it. Then the wall became more than defensive. It became constitutive, the thing that made the city a city, the physical expression of the distinction between the organized interior and the unorganized exterior, between the governed space and the ungoverned, between the civilization and what civilization defined itself against. The wall was no longer merely keeping something out. It was defining what was in, constituting the interior as the place where the specific practices that the civilization called civilized occurred, where the law applied, where the market operated, where the gods were properly honored, where the human being was fully human in the sense the civilization meant when it used that word. Outside the wall, not the enemy, necessarily, often the merely other, the merely different, the merely not here, the people and the practices that the civilization's self-definition required to be outside in order for inside to mean what it meant. The wall created the civilization as much as the civilization built the wall. They were the same gesture, the drawing of the line that made the inside possible by making the outside the outside. Fortress civilization, the organization of the entire civilizational project around the principle of the fortified interior, is not the same as the defensive wall. The defensive wall was built against a specific threat and was understood as a temporary measure, the specific protection against the specific danger that would eventually be resolved, the enemy defeated, the threat managed, the wall made less necessary by the peace its protection enabled. Fortress civilization is the condition in which the wall is not temporary, not a response to a specific threat but the permanent organizing principle of the civilizational project. In which the interior is not merely protected by the wall but defined by it, in which the civilization's entire logic, its governance, its economy, its social architecture, its cultural production, is organized around the maintenance of the distinction between inside and outside as the primary political fact. Fortress civilization does not build the wall against a specific enemy. It builds the wall because the wall is what civilization means. Because inside is where civilization is, and outside is where civilization is not. And the wall is the definitive statement of that distinction. Permanent, defended, constitutive of the identity it separates. The historical instances of fortress civilization share a specific set of characteristics that distinguish them from the ordinary civilization that builds walls for the ordinary purpose of defense. The internalization of the perimeter. In fortress civilization, the wall is not external to the civilizational project, not the infrastructure that protects the civilization while the civilization pursues its actual purposes. The wall is the project. The civilization's resources, its capital, its talent, its organizational energy, are directed primarily toward the maintenance and improvement of the perimeter. The refinement of the wall's technology, the extension of the surveillance architecture, the development of the deterrence systems, the cultivation of the loyalty that makes the perimeter's human components reliable, at the expense of the internal development that the perimeter was ostensibly protecting. The fortress civilization spends itself on its wall. And in spending itself on its wall, progressively reduces the internal vitality that made the wall worth building. The redefinition of civilization as exclusion. In ordinary civilization, the wall defines the inside as the place where civilization's project occurs, but the project itself is not defined by the wall. The project is the philosophy, the art, the commerce, the governance, the specifically human activities that the wall protects by keeping the barbarian outside. In fortress civilization, the project becomes the exclusion itself. The civilization's primary self-understanding, the story it tells about what makes it valuable, what justifies its existence, what distinguishes it from what is outside, becomes the story of the distinction. Not, we are civilized because we do these things. But, we are civilized because we are inside and they are outside. The wall becomes the civilization's identity rather than its protection. And the civilization that has made the wall its identity has made exclusion its purpose. And a civilization whose purpose is exclusion has no purpose beyond the wall. The progressive shrinking of the inside. Fortress civilization tends, historically, to contract. Not immediately. The fortress is built in a period of expansion, when the civilization has more resources than the wall requires, when the inside is generous, the perimeter expansive, the definition of who belongs broad enough to include most of those who consider themselves part of the civilizational project. Then the wall's maintenance cost rises, or the resources available to pay it decline, or the threat outside intensifies, or the definition of who belongs becomes more restrictive as the inside becomes more anxious about what is outside. The perimeter tightens. The definition of who belongs inside the definition contracts. The inside becomes smaller, more selected, more defended, more defined by its own narrowness. And the civilization that was once an expansive project becomes a defended remnant. Defended with increasing ferocity as its territory shrinks. Spending more of its diminishing resources on the wall that is protecting less and less of what it was supposed to protect. Until the wall is all that remains. The perimeter without the civilization it was built for. The fortress that has forgotten what it was fortifying. The return of fortress civilization in the compound era is distinguished from its historical predecessors by three features that make the contemporary version more durable, more total, and more difficult to disrupt than any prior instance. First, it is voluntary. The prior fortress civilizations, the walled city that refused to open its gates, the besieged palace that could not, were defensive responses to external threat. The fortress was built because the outside was dangerous, because the specific military, political, or cultural threat made the wall necessary. The contemporary compound's fortress civilization is not built under duress. It is built by choice, by the deliberate decision of the people with the most resources to organize those resources around the creation of a protected interior rather than the development of an open one. The outside is not militarily dangerous to the compound. The compound's deterrence architecture manages the outside's threat with the compound's autonomous systems. The wall is not built because the outside threatens. The wall is built because the inside prefers to be inside. Because the people with the resources to choose have chosen the interior. And the choice itself, free, deliberate, economically motivated, is more consequential than the defensive necessity that prior fortress civilizations were organized around. A civilization that walls itself off under threat might remove the wall when the threat passes. A civilization that walls itself off by choice has no reason to remove the wall when the choice remains rational. And the choice remains rational as long as the inside is better than the outside, which the compound is specifically organized to ensure in perpetuity. Second, it is self-sufficient. The prior fortress civilizations were fortresses in the military sense, defended against invasion, but remained economically connected to the territories beyond their walls. The medieval castle's food came from the surrounding manor. The walled city's commerce required the road outside its gate. The fortress that could not be penetrated could still be starved, could still be reduced by the siege that cut it off from the outside its inside required. The compound's fortress civilization is specifically engineered to close this vulnerability, to achieve the self-sufficiency that makes the siege impossible. The agricultural systems that feed the interior, the energy generation that powers it, the manufacturing that equips it, the medical systems that maintain it. The closed loop within which the compound civilization can sustain itself indefinitely without the outside's cooperation. Which is to say, the fortress civilization that cannot be starved. That requires nothing from outside that it cannot produce inside. That is, for the first time in the history of the fortress, genuinely self-contained. The self-sufficient fortress is not a temporary defensive posture. It is a permanent civilizational condition. The wall does not come down when the siege ends, because the siege cannot be mounted, because the fortress does not need what the siege would cut off. Third, it is technologically superior. The prior fortress civilizations were defended by the technology of their era, better walls, better weapons, better supply systems than the attackers could field, but not categorically superior. The besieging army used the same weapons as the defending garrison, the same siege technology, the same organizational principles. The compound's fortress civilization is defended by technology that is categorically different from anything the outside can field. The autonomous defense systems, the AI-directed perimeter, the cyber warfare architecture, the deterrent capabilities. That represent not a quantitative advantage over the outside's military capacity but a qualitative one. The outside cannot build what the compound has because the compound has closed the innovation loop, develops its military technology inside its wall with its closed innovation state's capabilities, and the outside's access to the compound's technological frontier is precisely what the wall was built to prevent. The compound's fortress civilization widens its technological advantage continuously, the gap between the compound's defense capability and the outside's challenge capability growing with each generation of the compound's closed innovation. The fortress that becomes more secure with each passing year, not through the accumulation of static defenses but through the dynamic advancement of the systems that make the outside's challenge progressively less credible, is the fortress that has solved the prior fortress civilization's fundamental vulnerability. The vulnerability to the patient siege, to the outside's accumulation of the capability to eventually overcome the wall. The compound's wall cannot be overcome by accumulation, because the compound is accumulating faster. The return of fortress civilization in the compound era is not experienced as a return. It is experienced as progress. This is the most important feature of the contemporary fortress civilization, the feature that distinguishes it from its historical predecessors in the political dimension. The historical fortress civilization knew it was a fortress. It knew its walls, celebrated its defenses, understood its condition as the defense of something specific against something threatening, had a name for what was outside and a theory of why the outside was dangerous. The compound's fortress civilization does not present itself as a fortress at all. It presents itself as an innovation hub, as a governance laboratory, as the leading edge of human development, the place where the future is being built, the point from which the advances that will eventually benefit everyone are being generated. The wall is not the fortress civilization's identity. The wall is the compound security infrastructure, the practical necessity of operating at the frontier of human capability in a world that has not yet caught up. The inside is not the fortress interior. It is the innovation environment, the specifically designed, carefully selected, continuously optimized space within which the kind of work that requires protection can proceed without the disruption of the outside's complexity. The outside is not the barbarian, the threatening other that the fortress is built against. It is the world in an earlier stage of development, the place that the compound's innovations will eventually reach, the beneficiary of the inside's work, once the inside's work is complete enough to distribute. This framing, the compound as frontier, not fortress, is the compound's most consequential political achievement. The conversion of the fortress civilization's logic, the inside's superiority, the outside's exclusion, the wall's permanence, into the language of progress, of development, of the inevitable advance of human capability that the compound happens to be leading. The fortress civilization that presents itself as progress cannot be challenged as a fortress civilization. It can only be challenged as an inadequate realization of progress, as a version of the future that has not yet delivered on its stated commitment to the outside's eventual benefit. And the inside, hearing this challenge, responds. We are working on it. The delivery is coming. The outside's patience says the price of the inside's work. Have patience. The fortress is not a fortress. It is a laboratory. And the laboratory is almost ready to publish. The new feudal architecture's fortress civilization has a specific relationship to history that the compound's governing class is acutely aware of. The relationship of recognition. The governing class knows what fortress civilizations have historically produced. Knows the pattern of the contraction, the calcification, the eventual collapse of the civilization that made the wall its organizing principle. And has organized the compound's design around the specific corrections that the historical pattern suggests. Against contraction, the compound selection and renewal architecture, the continuous curation of the population through the entry process and the scoring system, designed to prevent the demographic and cognitive stagnation that prior fortress civilizations suffered when the inside became too closed, too inbred, too cut off from the outside's generative diversity. The compound selects from the outside continuously. The compound's inside is not static. It renews itself through recruitment, through the extraction of the outside's most capable members, maintaining the internal vitality that static closure would have destroyed. The contraction is managed by making the inside permeable in one direction, talent flows in, nothing significant flows out. The inside does not contract. It deepens, becomes more capable, more selected, more cognitively concentrated, while remaining numerically stable through the selective admission that replaces attrition. Against calcification, the compound's innovation architecture, the closed innovation state's continuous commitment to the development of new capability, designed to prevent the intellectual stagnation that prior fortress civilizations suffered when the inside stopped generating the ideas that justified its existence. The compound is not defending an existing achievement. It is generating new ones. The inside is not the preservation of the past. It is the production of the future. The calcification is managed by making the inside's purpose forward-looking rather than conservative, directed not toward the defense of what is but toward the creation of what will be. Against collapse, the compound's self-sufficiency architecture, the closed-loop systems that eliminate the external dependencies that prior fortress civilizations could not survive the disruption of. The compound does not have the Achilles heel of the prior fortress civilization, the specific external dependency that the siege could target. The self-sufficiency is the anti-collapse mechanism, the fortress civilization that cannot be starved, cannot be sanctioned, cannot be pressured into the terms of the siege by the cutting of the specific supply that the siege was always designed to cut. The compound has studied the pattern. The compound has designed against the pattern. The compound believes it has solved the pattern. What the compound has not solved, what the historical pattern suggests cannot be solved from inside. is the failure mode that is not the fortress's weakness but the fortress's success. The failure that comes not from the wall being breached but from the inside becoming something that does not deserve to be inside the wall. The fortress civilization's deepest historical failure mode is not military defeat. Military defeat ends a fortress civilization, but it does not destroy the civilization. The civilization that is militarily defeated disperses, adapts, reconstitutes itself in new forms, in new territories, carrying its cultural inheritance into the new context. The deepest failure mode is cultural death from within. The condition in which the civilization that the fortress was built to protect has been so transformed by the fortress's logic, so organized around exclusion, so defined by the wall, so atrophied by the closure, that the civilization inside the wall is no longer the civilization the wall was built for. The fortress has protected the exterior. The interior has hollowed. Not through invasion. Through the specific cultural consequences of organizing a civilization around the principle of its own defense. The progressive narrowing of what the civilization considers worthy to what the fortress considers useful. The replacement of the civilization's cultural diversity, the diversity that generates the creativity that makes the civilization worth preserving, with the selected homogeneity of the population the entry process has optimized for productive utility. The loss of the capacity for self-criticism, the internal cultural capacity to question the civilization's own premises, as the selection process removes from the inside the people whose questioning is the mechanism of cultural renewal. The replacement of the civilization's genuine encounter with the outside, the encounter that has always generated the civilizational energy of the contact between different traditions, with the managed data streams through which the compound observes the outside without being changed by it. The fortress civilization that has replaced genuine encounter with managed observation, that has replaced cultural diversity with selected homogeneity, that has replaced self-criticism with continuous self-optimization, has built a very good fortress around a diminishing civilization. The return of fortress civilization is the new feudal architecture's most complete expression. Not in the sense of the most dramatic, not in the sense of the most militarily threatening, not in the sense of the most immediately consequential for the populations outside the wall, but in the sense of the most revealing. The expression that most completely shows what the compound secession doctrine actually is. What the 1% gone bad has actually done with the resources and the intelligence and the time horizon and the biological extension and the cognitive augmentation and the closed innovation and the autonomous defense and the sovereign territory. Has built, with all of it, a wall. And called the wall a civilization. And organized the civilization around the wall's maintenance. And made the wall's maintenance the civilization's highest purpose. And forgotten, progressively, irreversibly, over the generations that the longevity program has stretched into permanence. What the civilization was supposed to be for. Not the wall. Not the inside. Not the selected population optimized for productivity within the defended interior. The civilization was supposed to be for the human project. The messy, diverse, conflicted, generative, self-contradicting, creative, destructive, ultimately irreducible project of human beings figuring out, together, how to live. The fortress civilization has removed the together. And without the together, the figuring out is just optimization. And the optimization is just the wall. And the wall is just the wall. What does the outside do with the return of fortress civilization? The outside has limited options, the options that the compound's deterrence architecture, autonomous defense, economic management, and information control have left available. The outside cannot storm the wall has been designed against storming. The outside cannot starve the interior has been designed against siege. The outside cannot delegitimize the compound through the international frameworks, the compound has moved outside the international frameworks that legitimation depends on. What the outside can do, what the outside is doing, in the abandoned geographies and the subdued periphery and the between spaces of the new feudal architecture, is build. Not build another fortress, not replicate the compound's logic with fewer resources. Build the alternative to the fortress. The form of civilization that the fortress civilization's existence has made necessary. The civilizational architecture that does not organize itself around the wall but around the without wall. The open, distributed, networked civilizational form that the fortress's closure has made the only available alternative. Not because it is ideologically superior, though the argument can be made, but because it is the only form available to those the compound has excluded. The only form that the outside's resources can actually build. The form that does not require the compound's capital intensity, the compound's technological superiority, the compound's governance architecture, but requires what the outside has. Numbers, the 7, 8, 9 billion people who are not inside the compound. Distributed intelligence, the AI tools that the compound distributed during the transition period. The specific creativity of constraint, the lateral thinking, the adaptive organization, the ferocious imagination of people who have no option except to invent. And the knowledge. The specific, embodied, directly experienced knowledge of what the fortress civilization looks like from outside. Of what the wall costs the people who are not inside it. Of what a civilization organized around a wall has given up in order to build the wall. And what, in that giving up, remains possible. What the compound's closure has not closed. What the wall cannot reach. What is still open, still available, still generative in the space the fortress civilization has abandoned. The outside is building with what the compound has left it. The compound has left it everything that cannot be put inside a wall. The compound cannot wall in the capacity for solidarity, the specifically human capability to recognize the other's suffering as a claim on oneself. The compound cannot wall in the capacity for meaning, the specifically human practice of making the experience of being alive signify something beyond the optimization of its parameters. The compound cannot wall in the capacity for political imagination, the specifically human ability to conceive of arrangements that do not yet exist and to organize toward their realization. The compound cannot wall in the capacity for love, the specifically human experience of caring about someone whose value to you cannot be measured by any metric the compound scoring system recognizes. These capabilities are not efficient. They are not optimizable. They are not selectable for by the compound's entry process. They are the capabilities that the compound civilization has been progressively losing, progressively optimizing out, in the process of becoming what it has become. And they are what remains, outside the wall. In full, in excess, in the specific abundance of things that accumulate when no one has decided they are worth measuring. The outside has what the inside has been losing. The return of fortress civilization has left outside the wall everything that the fortress civilization forgot was civilization. The new feudal architecture is not the end of the story. It is the condition from which the next chapter begins. The specific configuration of power and exclusion and technological capability and human organization that the story has arrived at, and from which the story must now find its way forward. The forward is not guaranteed. The compound's architecture is very strong. The outside's disadvantage is very real. The wall is very high and the systems that maintain it are very sophisticated and the governing class that built it has very long time horizons and very powerful cognitive tools and very complete self-sufficiency. The compound will persist. For a long time. Perhaps for longer than prior civilizational arrangements persisted. But the fortress civilization, in every prior instance, has not been permanent. Not because it was defeated, sometimes it collapsed from within. But because the human project that the fortress civilization tried to contain within its walls could not be contained. Because the human project is not a project of the inside. It is the project of the encounter, the meeting at the edge, the contact between different ways of being human, the specific generativity of the between space, the space the fortress civilization has abandoned, and tried to call terrain, and that the outside is now, slowly, quietly, building into something. Something the Fortress civilization's models do not have a category for. Because the category was left outside the wall. Along with everything else the compound decided was not worth taking in. The wall was always the confession, every wall was the confession of the civilization that built it, the admission that what was inside needed the wall's protection, that the inside was not strong enough, not confident enough, not generous enough to exist without the wall. The strong civilization does not need the wall. The strong civilization opens its gates, invites the encounter, absorbs the difference, is changed and enriched and renewed by what comes through. The civilization that walls itself is the civilization that has stopped believing in its own strength, that has traded the confidence of openness for the security of closure, that has decided that what it hates is more valuable than what it might become through encounter. The compound has made this trade. The compound has chosen the wall over the encounter, the security of the inside over the generativity of the meeting. The compound is very secure. The compound is very inside. The compound is building within its walls, the most technically sophisticated civilization in the history of the species, and it is losing, with each generation that the longevity program extends behind the wall, the thing that made civilization worth building, the encounter with the other, the meeting that changes you, the contact that makes you more than what you were before the contact, the specifically human experience of being changed by what you did not expect, of being enlarged by what the wall was built to keep out. The wall keeps it out, the compound is safe, the compound is diminishing. Not in power, not in capability, not in the metric the compound measures itself by, but in the quality of what it is for, the slowly emptying interior of the fortress civilization that has perfected its defenses and forgotten its purpose, that has made the wall so big it can no longer see over it, that has secured itself so completely against the outside that the outside is no longer imaginable from inside, and without the imagination of the outside, the inside cannot imagine anything it has not already imagined. And without that imagination, the civilization inside the wall is not advancing toward the future. It is orbiting its own founding, circling the moment the wall went up, forever, in the specific stasis of the system that has optimized itself into perfection, and discovered that perfection is another word for the end of the becoming that was civilization's actual project. Outside the wall, the becoming continues, imperfect, unoptimized, dangerous, alive. Discussion about this episode. Comments.
And it's not just about you as an individual, it's about how you fit into your community and the planet. That's the ethos we're building here. Flourishing, inside and out.